I wanted to do is to talk just a little bit about contemplation. What is it? And again, we're weaving back and forth between the cloud of unknowing and our contemporary reference points in contemplative outreach. So, if you're a regular practitioner of centering prayer, it will be indelibly etched in your mind that contemplation is resting in God. And this is the beautiful, simple explanation condensed by Thomas Keating from the teaching of Pope Gregory the Great, who has lived in the late 6th, early 7th century. This resting implies, as we all know from centering prayer, a movement beyond all thinking, emoting, sensing, and self-reflection, and to rest in simple presence. And Thomas likes to use the image that comes out of the Psalm 134, is it? That says, "Lord, I keep my soul at peace like a weaned child in mother's arms." So that's the image of resting in God. So that distinction and that definition has become a mainstay, a basic element in contemplative outreach pedagogy. And there's nothing wrong with it. But like all truths, it's a bit of a basic truths. It's a bit of a simplification. It is certainly true that contemplation requires going beyond the cataphatic practices. And I've used this term cataphatic a couple of times now, and people may say, well, what's that mean? Well, one of the basic lines of division when you're talking about spiritual theology are apophatic and cataphatic. And cataphatic practices and forms are forms of prayer and worship and understanding that make use of our faculties. So our faculties are, according to Thomas Aquinas and in a long tradition, our reason, our emotions, our will, our memory. Those are the biggies. So if a practice is making use of those things, is cultivating them, is developing them, then it's a cataphatic practice. Apophatic practice does not make use of those faculties. It, depending on how you look at it, it bypasses them, end runs them, or transcends them. And the reason for this, basically, is cataphatic practice basically goes back and reinforces our usual, normal sense of small self, our narrative self. That means my story of me. I was born, I have this Enneagram type, this history, this kind of relationship, these emotions, these wills, these yearnings, this is who I am. That's our usual sense of self. Apophatic practice really corresponds to a different, much more unboundaried self. It begins at the threshold of what the Eastern traditions would call witnessing presence. So it's no longer trying to find identity by our narration of who I am and what my history was. And it doesn't make use of the faculties that keep pulling us back to the smaller self. So I would say that certainly when we talk about contemplation in the Christian West and the Christian East, we're talking about the apophatic domain. And that means that we're quite right that contemplation won't begin until you've learned to break your exclusive and even obsessive reliance on the faculties and the sense of self that's generated by them. And that, for me, was the extraordinary breakthrough that Thomas Keating and Centering Prayer movement brought to our Christian spiritual reawakening. Because basically, up to that point, the only kind of practice that we knew, that we worked on, that we discussed, that we engaged in the Christian community, apart from sort of isolated cells in monasteries, was cataphatic practice. And cataphatic practice reinforces the cataphatic sense of self. And cataphatic sense of self reinforces the cataphatic practices. And so you wind up thinking that this is all there is. Your history, your soul, your reality in God is the story of you floating through this finite timeline in life with your particular defining characteristics, emotions, feelings, etc. What Centering Prayer and the whole contemplative awakening did was that it, by giving us this bracketed space and saying we're going to sit, we're going to let go of thinking, we're going to suspend use of cataphatic faculties, it allowed people to have a taste of apophatic experience and apophatic selfhood. So in that sense, Thomas's definition is not only correct, but a lifesaver, because you're not going to experience this apophatic contemplative reality until you are resting in God. In other words, until your usual faculties of perception are on the pause button. But in the Christian East particularly, the idea that centering prayer, that the apophatic experience or that contemplation is therefore content-free is a misperception. And it's one that's causing us a lot of difficulty nowadays as we've come to think of contemplation as basically emptiness, just simple resting, no thoughts, no feeling, nothing going on. But in our classic kind of understanding of it, that contemplation is traditionally associated with a kind of beholding, a seeing, a luminous and radiant perception, a knowing impregnated by love, as it was once defined, which does indeed have content, if you want to call it that. In other words, something is actually conveyed. There's an energetic, relational, informational component that happens to it. The only thing is that it operates at a level far higher, deeper, and more luminous than the cataphatic experience and the sense of selfhood that corresponds to it. So the journey has basically been conceived of as a lifetime of inner refinement and preparation and preparing, which is integral. That as you spend more and more time hanging out in those apophatic practices, you also begin to grow an apophatic selfhood, which looks nothing like your personal history and time. They're not unrelated, but they're related like the sliver, the crescent of the moon, and the full of the moon, if you want. The one is so much deeper and vaster. So I think that this state then has been regarded traditionally in both the Christian West and the Christian East as an extraordinary gift, the gift of luminous vision, and prepared for by a long and integral life of moral, physiological, neurological preparation. And I think it's one of the reasons why you will sometimes find traditionally trained contemplatives gritting their teeth when you find folks like us who are managing to sit on our prayer mats twice a day for 20 minutes, confidently proclaiming ourselves as contemplatives. You know, it's like, contemplation is not the automatic perk of a meditation method if you do it. It's the fruit of a long journey of a completely different order. So I think we need to be more respectful of our tradition in the way we use this term contemplation, realizing there's much more involved in it, and to understand and make way for that with all due humility, and to cooperate in the work of it. And yet, I think it's tremendously important that we begin to see that contemplative, the practice that has come to us in centering prayer and contemplative outreach, is beginning to open the gateway to a different kind of perception, which is really becoming of the mature human being. We need to have more people in our planet attaining something approximating contemplative realization if our planet is going to survive the assaults that people frozen at the level of consciousness that humanity's basically frozen at are going to be running this place. So we need this growing, and what Thomas has given us that I think is, I wish he'd gotten the Nobel Peace Prize somewhere along the way, because he's given us the first seeds on the journey to start growing a humanity that can become truly non-identified, truly non-violent, truly capable to come from a different place that sees what needs doing and doing it. We just have to be a little careful about these terms, particularly contemplative lifestyle, which is pretty much an oxymoron. And to be a little bit more humbly. You don't own contemplative because you do centering prayer. But God help you if you start on the journey that it's pointing you on, grow, do the work, and above all, don't back away from the new windows on compassionate selfhood that it's opening up. Then you may just at some point understand what this contemplation is all about. So journey begins with, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step. This is step one. It's great. Nobody's been stepping for a long time. So I would say, and what I'm going to work on is that for our author of The Cloud of Unknowing, and indeed in general, the word contemplation in the West is a functional equivalent of a stabilized non-dual consciousness in the West or in the East. In other words, people, when they try and line things up between Eastern models and Western models, say, well, is contemplation, is this contemplative, is it a mystical experience, is it the unitive way? Well, it's the unitive way, but not the way the unitive way is typically understood. The unitive way, as we've understood it in the West, is that your heart and your affections and your purity and your yearning for God and God's yearning for you get so great that, boom, you come together like a mystical marriage. It tends to be described in the affective realm. And I think that what contemplation where it really is happening is in the perceptual realm. That yes, you and God become united because what drops out is this subject-object mechanism that makes you the subject and God the object, or God the subject and you the object. The perceptual field comes to oneness. You see from oneness. And so even terms like God and yourself become too heavy. You don't need them. They're not appropriate to that operating system of perception. Try that out on somebody who hasn't attained to that yet, and they say, you mean you're God? You mean there's no God? They keep trying to pull it back to the only way the middle mind can do it, which is to say there is this thing called God, and we are in relationship with God, and God either loves us or hates us, and we're either good or bad. That's thinking at the cataphatic level. At the next level out, the whole picture changes because the way the perceptual mechanism is working changes. So I think contemplation really, and certainly in the cloud of unknowing, stands for this gradual transition into an operating system, into a level of consciousness that perceives reality through subject-object attention in that way, which generates a sense of selfhood that consists of me. I am the subject of my own world, and I have all these characteristics that make me unique, i.e. different from everybody else. And it's this unique me that God loves. That's the way thinking works at that level. But there's another level in which perception is really holographic, diffuse. You simply are able to kind of take in the whole picture at once without setting up the playing field and subject-object. The sense of you no longer depends on your identity, on your causes, on the language you tell yourself, on the, my teacher, Rafe, used to say about that selfhood, I want to have enough being to be nothing. Because at that level, your identity is so hidden with Christ in God, as they say in Colossians, that you don't need to wear out external definers to pull yourself back in. So there is a transition space. And if you've done any work with contemporary maps of consciousness, levels of consciousness, some of the work of Ken Wilber and spiral dynamics, you'll know that we now have these wonderful hierarchies of consciousness that grew up in the late 20th century, early 21st, that basically see us running from magical consciousness, like little children, boogeymen, gods, heavens, to mythic membership where you're allied with the group, to rational consciousness, then into things that you'll nowadays hear being bandied about as pluralistic or integral, the capacity to really genuinely say coexist, to deal with ambiguity, with plurality, with multiplicity. And finally, we jump into what's then called the non-dual stages. And if you read some of the maps, there's, Christ consciousness, all sorts of 3 or so levels of non-dual consciousness. But people say, well, what's non-dual? Well, my sense is that non-dual is the place where this operating system really shifts. That the first lower tiers, we still are working with this subject-object. I'm here, this is me, this is my history, I am a soul, I am before God. All of a sudden, at the non-dual level, the playing field reconfigures out of a participational oneness that basically functions in terms of no separation, because the perceptual field is undivided. And a lot of people are talking about this nowadays. What makes it interesting to me is that the cloud of unknowing was talking about this in the 14th century. And the place where he specifically anchors and roots the work of contemplation, as he calls it, is at the junction point between classic cataphatic consciousness and cataphatic selfhood and the movement into this other, which we would now call apophatic or non-dual perception. That's where he puts it. And he sees contemplation not as some specific state of grace that comes to you, but he sees it as a work which you engage at a certain stage in your readiness, in your preparation, with the advice of a spiritual guide. But the specific work of reframing, rewiring, if you want to call it that, the channels of perception, specifically around the configuration of attention, so as to support a different kind of knowing, a different kind of selfhood, a different kind of presence. And he's already seeing this. And if it's hard enough to talk about it in the 21st century, right after lunch, imagine how it must have been in the 14th century with a language that was only beginning to emerge as English, and where he's having to talk mostly in metaphors to describe stuff that most people can't even see. So it's a tremendously profound thing. But I would present to you that the Cloud of Unknowing is the earliest known Western study of the typology of consciousness. And that it coming from the 14th century, it's about 6 centuries earlier than anything else, and that it hovers around this break exactly with what Ken Wilber would now call the break between second and third tier, or the entry into non-dual states, which he precisely correlates with the work of contemplation. The work of contemplation is to bring us to the threshold of non-dual perception and take us over that threshold. So I want to show you how he does this, because this has some profound implications for the next generation of centering prayer teaching, and certainly centering prayer practice, that I think it's important to be aware of. It's also a profound hint as to where Christianity's theoretically missing non-dual tradition actually hangs out. So what he does in Cloud 8, which is for me one of the most amazing chapters in the Cloud of Unknowing, he starts out right where he left off in Cloud 7. Remember Cloud 7, they're having this joust with the thought, and then the authors take one little word and use it and hang on to this word like your shield and butler, whether you're riding in peace or in war, he says. So then at the beginning of Cloud 8, he starts out and says, well, why? Why are you counseling me then to give up my holy meditations, my spiritual exercises, they hadn't been invented yet, but, my self-reflections, my scrupulosity, my pondering of my own sinfulness? Why are you telling me to give this up? And he goes on to say, if they do me so much good, and if they so much increase my devotion, why are you telling me to give them up? It's a fair question, isn't it? And as a matter of fact, the question is exactly in that basket from one of you all. What is the place of them? So he answers in a absolutely wonderful way by giving us a map. And it's the first known map of consciousness in the West. So this passage goes like this. It's in the middle of Cloud 8, and I'll come back to it and then break it down. And where you ask me why you should put it, i.e. the thought, down beneath the cloud of forgetting, since it is good in its nature when it is well used, and does you so much good and increases your devotion so much, to this I answer and say to you, there are two kinds of lives in the Holy Church. One is the active life, and the other is the contemplative life. Okay, so far so good. It sounds like you've heard this before, right? And then he goes, the active is the lower, and the contemplative is the higher. Okay, so far so good. We've heard these maps. Most of Western Christendom is divided on this map. But listen what he's going to do. The active life has 2 degrees, a lower and a higher. So yes, if you're taking notes, draw this little schematic. Draw active and and contemplative. And then the active life has 2 degrees, a lower and a higher. Or he says the active life has 2 degrees, a higher and a lower, and the contemplative life also has 2 degrees, a lower and a higher. And these lives are coupled together in such a way that although they are different in some ways, yet neither of them may be had without some part of the other, because the higher part of the active life is at the same time the lower part of the contemplative life. So let's begin by just looking at the schematic, which he's going to work in a really interesting way. So he divides the field into active, which is the lower, contemplative, which is the higher. But then he subdivides the 2 into lower active, higher active, lower contemplative, and higher contemplative. So all of a sudden we have a full 4-fold schematic, right? And then the next thing he does is draw a circle around higher active and lower contemplative, so they become something like a chain link fence. So the 2 of them are basically intertwined. And then he goes on to say, because of this, a man may not be fully active unless he is partly contemplative. Right? Well, you can see why he can say that. Because if part of the higher active has already got the lower contemplative in it, then you can't be fully completing the higher active until you've got a little bit of contemplative in it. And then he says, nor may he be fully contemplative, as it may be had here, unless he is in part active. Okay, that's really interesting, isn't it? The condition of the active life is such that it both begun and ended in this life, but not so the contemplative life, for it is begun in this life and shall last without end, for the part Mary chose shall never be taken away. So another way of saying it begins in this life and ends in this life is to say that it lives under the condition of time. So he says that the active life begins and ends within the conditions of time. And the contemplative life begins in those conditions, but transcends them. Another way of looking at it. That doesn't necessarily mean that you live forever in a gated community in heaven. It means that somehow there's something in the quality of consciousness that transcends time when you reach a certain place in this. We'll hold on to that. And if you're a cloud aficionado, you'll go back and look at some of his reflections on time, and they'll blow your mind. Anyway, so he's devised this schematic. So you've got lower active. Then you've got this melange of higher active, lower contemplative. Then you've got higher contemplative. And now he's going to go in for the kill, if you can talk about this, and define what each of these levels consists of. So he says, the lower part of the active life consists of good and honest bodily works of charity and mercy. Okay, that's pretty straight up, isn't it? Okay. And then listen, the higher part of the active life and the lower part of the contemplative life lie in good spiritual meditations and consistent looking into, or literally beholding, a man's own wretchedness with sorrow and contrition, looking into the passion of Christ and his servants with pity and compassion, and into the wonderful gifts, kindness, and works of God in all his creatures, both bodily and spiritual, with gratitude and praise. But the higher part of contemplation, as it may be had here, hangs all wholly in this darkness and in this cloud of unknowing, with a love stirring and a blind beholding into the naked being of God himself only. Well, let's come back and unpack that, because I think under all that fancy language, there's something really simple and interesting being said. The lower part of the active life consists of good and honest bodily works of charity and mercy. In other words, living the gospel, being a good church citizen, doing the work of kindness and mercy, compassion, generosity. The fundamental ethical morality training, which is the beginning of every healthy spiritual education, right? But what happens here in the second? The higher active and lower contemplative lie in good spiritual meditation and consistent beholding of a man's own wretchedness and sorrow and contrition, meditations, looking at the passion of Christ. What has happened at this thing? What's the difference between lower active, good bodily works of charity and morality, and this one, the higher part, the looking into? What's entered there? Anybody know? Humility, you're close. Meditation, well, close. But what capacity has been awakened that wasn't there before? Self-reflection, right? And this is really important because we see this so often out in life, and it's a kind of classic AA story. Somebody's hammering along, doing the good works, coming to church on Sundays, going to confession when they have to, paying the tithes, pledging and living out there in the world without much thought. Bang. It all falls apart, Yeah, you can call it the second. It tends to happen in the second half of life. But all of a sudden, you're face up against the recognition that your life as it was had become unmanageable. And, AA is a profoundly marks the gateway for many people between the lower active and the higher active. All of a sudden, you step across the border into who am I? What the hell am I doing anyway? And sometimes that movement into actually occupying your life with reflection will happen when life upsets you. A spouse leaves, a child dies, a job collapses, and all of a sudden that life that you used to be living on autopilot. It's about grades, it's about achievement, it's about outer your friends, your family, your house, your social status, that completely external life. All of a sudden, it comes inside. And you wake up and you start to say, hey, I have an inside too. And this is exactly the place that this 14th century author is celebrating as the place where we actually move into our true humanity. It's when we wake up inside. It's when we begin to become self-reflective. When we ask the questions, who am I? What am I doing? What am I doing here? What am I doing it for? That life can begin to take on some value and some meaning. And, it's really funny that however you would want to kind of cut the thin line of division between higher active and lower contemplative, we saw you often in our social medias or in our networks today. It's the recovery movement and some of the self-hope and self-inquiry human potential movements that are really taking up the slack in these things. And people will start with programs that we embrace just because we want to live our life better. Like people will start meditation because they're too stressed out at work, or because they start yoga because they're concerned that their body is falling apart. And so you'd start from these motivations of just trying to make your active life work better. But these modalities then give way into more and more genuine inquiry. You start studying the Enneagram because you wonder what type you are. And all of a sudden you think, well, how do I transform? And who am I anyway? So there's a kind of really tight conveyor belt that goes from higher active with kind of more secular starting points into the lower contemplative, which is really the bona fide start of the spiritual journey. And I would say that one of the things that's happening in the world, at least as I look at it at this point, is that the church has been really, really good at doing lower active, but it hasn't been awful good at working with people that as they begin to start the really introspective, as they step into the higher active and then the lower contemplative. And a lot of the work there has really, the slack has been taken up by the lay movements and by the secular movements, recovery, AA and the general wellness movements, yoga, Enneagram, you name the modalities, but they're the ones that are really meeting people. And centering prayer certainly is meeting people as they begin to make this practice. Let's get out of the unreflected, the unexamined life, which is not worth living, and step into our true humanity. So what this author is saying is that when that self-reflective potential wakes up in you, the traditional cataphatic practices are super. They're absolutely perfect because they take that dawning, awakening introspection, deepen it, fine-tune it. You have to talk again with such respect for the spiritual exercises that they're brilliant here in taking the first wellsprings of awakening and taking it deeper and deeper and deeper into, well, who am I in God? Where am I going? What is this about? To really cultivate it. And the classic meditations, the meditations, for example, on the sorrows of Christ, the beautiful devotions like the Stations of the Cross in particular are wonderful tools for awakening that deepening sense of reflection. And Lectio Divina, as it's practiced with greater depths as we move back and forth between the scriptural story and my own story. What does this story say to me? That's a profoundly liberating question, isn't it? And if you think it's good with the regular Bible stories, try it with the Gospel of Thomas, which reads like an incredible kind of Rorschach of your own spiritual journey. It's amazing. So the whole broad belt of spiritual practices we have are really aimed at taking people from higher active to lower contemplative and to develop a deepening degrees of self-reflection, self-mastery, and self-understanding at that finite level. And the author of The Cloud says that's all great, but it's not the end of the journey. So he uses this deeply metaphoric language to say, but the higher part of contemplation, remember there is lower contemplative and higher? The higher part of contemplation, as it may be had here, hangs all wholly in this darkness and in this cloud of unknowing, with a loving stirring and a blind beholding. Now, I'm just going to jump to the chase because I can't do the whole analysis in my text, but blind beholding means to look without using that subject-object capacity of the mind, to see from diffuse awareness. And I can prove that in the book, but I'm not going to do it right here. With a loving stirring and blind beholding in the naked being of God himself only. These are fast code words to talk about what it means to enter that bandwidth of experience where the self-reflective capacity is suspended or transcended. Not from below, but because because you just go back on autopilot, but from above, because the subject-object dichotomy collapses, and you are one with the whole field, with the subjectivity, and perceiving out of that oneness. Very, very different. So he's trying to explore these, which would be the classic, if you demetaphorize this, these are classic sort of definitions, clinical measurements, if you want, of what non-dual perception looks like. Ken Wilber's new book will be out by the end of the year, and you can check that out yourself, what the measures are of non-dual perception. So then he goes on to say this, which I think is lovely. In the lower part of the active life, a man is without himself and beneath himself. Without himself because there's no reflective faculty yet. Does that make sense? You know, you're all going through the motions. Like the death of Ivan Illich, your whole life is just doing what is expected. And beneath himself. Well, beneath because you can only become fully human as you begin to exercise this capacity that, so far as we know, only human beings have been endowed with, which is this capacity for self-reflective consciousness, for standing outside yourself, for looking at yourself, for measuring time and space, for thinking of yourself in third person and saying, well, how is this thing doing? He says, in the higher part of the active life and the lower part of the contemplative life, a man is within himself and even with himself. Beautiful. So that when we begin to do this reflective work, when we embark on the journey, we move inside. We develop an inside, as Teilhard de Chardin would say. We develop a true interiority, and we can live with ourselves. We can live in our own skins. That's part of what psychological work has us to do, because we've realized more and more how much our life, in the world, our projections, our violence, our cruelty, is because we're not comfortable in our own skins. But then he goes on to say, but in the higher part of the contemplative life, a man is above himself and under his God. Above himself he is because he intends to win by grace what he cannot come to by nature, that is to say, to be knit to God in spirit and onehood of love and accordance of will. Above himself also because that you're no longer coming back to that finite, narratively generated sense of selfhood. I am me. I am an Enneagram 3. I am a Pisces. I am I have this history. I am a victim. We're no longer going there. Boom. We are simply lost in the dance, as it were, but alive in the dance, found in the dance. So I would say that what he's trying to do then is to create a typology of different levels of perception around the principle of self-reflection. And once he's got this in place, then he can say very clearly what it is about the cataphatic practices. That practices that we have classically worked with in church, in our religious upbringing, in our spiritual nature, are aimed at the higher active, lower contemplative, to develop self-reflection and to develop a clearer and more profound and responsible sense of selfhood. And in that sense, they're very, very good. But they still cater to the idea, the mirage of a finite self, and they still work strongly within the cataphatic faculties. Beyond that is the apophatic path, which leaves these faculties behind, and the apophatic or contemplative selfhood, which is unboundaried, positionless, full, and flowing. And so what he's basically saying is that if you want to taste this other, and allow it to become the whole of yourself, then you have to suspend using the practices that are reinforcing the cataphatic self. That makes sense? He has a wonderful, wonderful sort of quote, if I can find it here, his final, as he goes in for his QED. He says that just as and right as it is impossible to man's understanding to come to the higher part of the active life if he does not cease for a time the lower part, so it is that a man shall not come to the higher part of the contemplative life unless he ceases for a time the lower part. In other words, as any person in AA knows, you're not going to come to your new kind of consciousness if you're still hanging out with your old drinking buddies. You have to give them up in order for the new to stabilize. And that's exactly the argument he's making here. If you're really going to nurture and develop and explore this new hard wiring of consciousness, you've got to stop feeding the practices and the sense of selfhood that bring you back to the old. It's a manifestly logical argument, and I think, again, we can bracket it in centering prayer. I have a question in the box that says, well, what does this mean? Should we give up all our other practices? No, only during the time of centering prayer. Don't start doing your Ignatian exercises during the time you're doing centering prayer. When you're clear, be clear. Do your practices intentionally. Because I'd like to add just one little thing here before we take a break, a little stretch break, that very often in the maps of the hierarchies of consciousness that we've acquired basically from the East and the West, I would say, I would wash out my mouth with soap and be a feminist and say they're male maps because they all are pointing to a top and they're all hierarchical. But we get the idea, whether it's the ladder of spiritual ascent or the third tier of consciousness, that the idea is that you're supposed to get there and never go back again. I don't believe that is so. And I don't believe that the incarnation of Jesus happened to prove that that's so. I believe that what happens really is that it is from that taste of the apophatic, non-dual, unboundaried selfhood that we finally acquire the freedom, the confidence, the abundance, and the intimacy to enter back into our own finite skins as cosmic servants. Because one of the problems with egoic perception, since it perceives by separating the playing field, I'm here, everything else is out there, is that it's always perceiving in halves by separation, and therefore has built into it this Planck's constant of anxiety. Who am I? Am I doing enough? Are they noticing me? Is it safe? Is it good? This constant narrative of trying to make myself whole, of making myself healthy, of making myself well. And you can't do it at that level because it doesn't, what you're yearning for is true, but it doesn't come from that level. And so by being able to stabilize this place where you actually taste the intimacy, the spaciousness, and the infinitude of your participation in divine consciousness, you come back and the rest of the world is relativized in a wonderful way. There's nothing to prove. You have a year left to live cosmically. You're not having to assert, insist, urge, prove, demonstrate. You simply do, moving in the tempo of the objective field of reality, which is compassionate love, which is the divine intimacy, which you can taste in this nanosecond in your heart and live for the rest of your life in the world. So I believe that we are truly called to come back into our own skins, to pick up our finite selfhoods, purged, cleared, relativized as well as we can, and to live in the world as bold servants of cosmic love. But that ain't going to happen until we've tasted the root of ourself. And that's the gift that contemplative practice has to give you.